Humans are creative creatures. We've built magnificent art, composed beautiful music, written profound literature, and invented torture devices so horrifyingly brutal that they make horror movies look like children's cartoons. Because apparently, when it came to hurting other humans, our ancestors decided that regular violence wasn't enough. They needed devices, contraptions, machines specifically engineered to maximize suffering while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. We're not talking about quick deaths here. We're talking about slow, agonizing, mind-breaking torture that could last hours, days, or even weeks. And the worst part? Many of these devices were used on people who committed minor crimes, stole a loaf of bread, Iron Maiden, spoke out against the church, the rack, looked at someone funny, scavenger's daughter. Human ingenuity is amazing, truly. We went from discovering fire to inventing mechanical devices that rip people apart joint by joint. Evolution at its finest. But before we dive into this mechanical nightmare that makes Saw look like amateur hour, if you enjoy learning about the darkest corners of human history, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you're grateful you weren't born in medieval Europe, and comment below which torture device sounds the most terrifying. Choose your nightmare fuel. Now let's explore humanity's creativity at its absolute worst. Let's start with one of the most sadistic devices ever created, the Brazen Bull, also known as the Bronze Bull or the Sicilian Bull. This nightmare machine was invented around 560 BC by a Greek brass worker named Parallaeus of Athens. And when I say invented, I mean he specifically designed it as a torture and execution device and then pitched it to Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in Sicily, like it was a business proposal. Hey boss, I made a bull that cooks people alive and makes their screams sound like music. Want to buy it? Here's how this monstrosity worked. The Brazen Bull was a life-sized hollow bronze sculpture of a bull. Beautiful craftsmanship, really. Shiny, detailed, probably took months to make. But inside, pure nightmare fuel. The victim would be placed inside the bull through a door in the side. Then the door would be locked. And here's where it gets absolutely diabolical. A fire would be lit underneath the bull. The bronze would heat up slowly, essentially turning the inside into an oven. The victim would be roasted alive, slowly. The bronze conducted heat efficiently, which meant the temperature inside would rise gradually, cooking the person from the outside in. We're talking about a slow roast that could take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on how hot they made the fire. But Parallaeus wasn't satisfied with just cooking people alive. No, that would be too simple. He added acoustic tubes and pipes inside the bull's head that would convert the victim's screams into sounds that resembled a bull bellowing. The idea was to create musical entertainment while someone was being cooked to death. The screams would be transformed into haunting, melodic sounds that would echo from the bull's mouth. Parallaeus was so proud of his invention that he demonstrated it to Phalaris. And here's where karma comes in beautiful and swift. Phalaris was so disturbed and disgusted by the device that he had Parallaeus locked inside his own creation as the first victim. The inventor became the first test subject of his own torture device. Some sources say Phalaris let him out before he died. Others say he cooked completely. Either way, Parallaeus learned a valuable lesson about pitching torture devices to tyrannical rulers. But the story doesn't end there. Phalaris actually kept the bull and used it regularly on criminals and enemies. Historical accounts suggest dozens of people were executed in the Brazen Bull during his reign. The device became so infamous that it was mentioned by multiple ancient historians, including Pindar, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus. The bull would be placed in a public square during executions. Crowds would gather to watch. The fire would be lit. And as the victim inside began to scream, the haunting sounds of the bull would fill the air. Ancient accounts describe it as both horrifying and mesmerizing. People couldn't look away even though they knew what was happening inside. And here's a disturbing detail. The bronze would be polished to a mirror shine, so the crowd could see their own reflections in the bull while listening to the musical screams of someone being cooked alive. It was psychological warfare as much as physical torture. A reminder that this could happen to anyone who crossed the tyrant. The device eventually became Phalaris's downfall. When he was overthrown in 554 BC, the people of Acragas were so angry about his use of the Brazen Bull that they executed him in the same device. He was locked inside his beloved torture instrument and roasted alive while the crowd cheered. The bull that had killed so many finally claimed its most famous victim. Some historians debate whether the brazen bull actually existed or was just a legend, but multiple ancient sources describe it in detail, and similar devices have been documented in other cultures. Whether this specific bull was real or not, the concept was definitely real, and that's disturbing enough. If you think cooking people alive in a metal bull is bad, wait until you hear about a device that literally stretched people until their joints separated. The rack is probably one of the most famous torture devices in history, and for good reason. It's simple, effective, and absolutely brutal. The concept is straightforward. Stretch a human body until the joints separate and the ligaments tear. Easy to build, easy to use, maximum suffering, medieval efficiency at its finest. Here's how it worked. The rack was essentially a rectangular wooden frame with two rollers, one at each end. The victim would be laid on their back on the frame. Their ankles would be attached to one roller, their wrists to the other. Then the torturer would turn a handle that would slowly rotate the rollers, pulling the victim's limbs in opposite directions. At first, it would just feel like an uncomfortable stretch, maybe similar to a really aggressive yoga session. But as the rollers kept turning, the stretch would become painful. Your joints would start to strain, your muscles would scream in protest, and the torturer would just keep turning that handle. The beauty of the rack, from a torture perspective, was that it was gradual. The torturer had complete control over the speed and intensity. They could stretch you just enough to cause extreme pain without permanent damage, which was useful during interrogations. Or they could keep going until your body literally came apart at the seams. When the tension became too much, things started breaking. First, your joints would dislocate. Shoulders, hips, knees, elbows would all pop out of their sockets with audible cracks that echoed through the torture chamber. Victims described feeling their bones separate as if their body was being torn in half. But the torturer wouldn't stop there. As the stretching continued, your ligaments would begin to tear. The connective tissue holding your joints together would rip like wet paper. Your spine would elongate, crushing vertebrae and damaging the spinal cord. Some victims were stretched so much that they grew several inches taller, though their bodies were so damaged they could never walk again. And if the torturer really wanted to make a point, they'd keep turning until limbs actually separated from the body. Yes, the rack could literally pull your arms and legs off if they cranked it hard enough. Historical records document cases where victims were dismembered by the rack, though this was rare because most people confessed or passed out from pain long before that point. The psychological torture was almost as bad as the physical. You'd be lying there, completely helpless, watching the torturer's hand on that crank. Every turn meant more pain, and you had no idea when they'd stop. Would they dislocate one joint? All of them? Would they kill you? The uncertainty was agonizing. The rack was used extensively during the Spanish Inquisition. Religious authorities would use it to extract confessions from heretics, witches, and anyone else they deemed problematic. The church had rules about torture, believe it or not. You couldn't draw blood or permanently maim someone. The rack was perfect because technically it didn't violate those rules. It just destroyed your body from the inside. The Tower of London was famous for its use of the rack. The torture chamber there, known as the dungeon, housed several racks that were used on prisoners throughout the medieval period. Guy Fawkes, the infamous gunpowder plot conspirator, was tortured on the rack in 1605. Historical documents show that King James I personally authorized his torture and ordered the torturers to use the rack, gently at first, then by degrees proceeding to the worst. Fawkes was racked so severely that he couldn't sign his own confession. When you look at historical documents, his signature is barely legible, just a shaky scrawl that shows how badly damaged his hands and arms were. He could barely hold a quill after the torture. One particularly disturbing aspect of the rack was that victims who survived often wished they hadn't. The damage was so severe that most were permanently disabled. Dislocated joints that were never properly reset, torn ligaments that never healed, spinal damage that left them in constant pain. Some victims became paralyzed, others could barely move. The rack didn't just torture you in the moment, it tortured you for the rest of your life. Stretching people until they break is horrific, but what if we went in the opposite direction? What if instead of pulling you apart, we crushed you together? If the rack stretched you apart, the scavenger's daughter crushed you together. This device was invented in the 16th century by Sir Leonard Skeffington, Lieutenant of the Tower of London. It was also known as Skeffington's daughter or the scavenger's daughter, and it was designed to do the exact opposite of the rack while being equally brutal. The device consisted of metal bars that formed a hoop. The victim would be forced into a kneeling position, and the hoop would be tightened around their body, forcing their head down to their knees and their knees up to their chest. Imagine being folded in half and then compressed even further. Your body would be crushed into an impossibly tight ball. As the device tightened, your spine would compress. Your ribs would press against your internal organs. Your knees would be forced into your chest so hard that breathing became difficult. The pressure on your body was immense and constant. Unlike the rack, which pulled you apart, this device squeezed you until your body couldn't take it anymore. The immediate effects were agonizing. Your muscles would cramp from being forced into such an unnatural position. Your joints would scream in pain as they were compressed beyond their normal range. Your lungs couldn't fully expand, so you'd be in a constant state of oxygen deprivation, gasping for air that wouldn't come. But the real damage came from the internal pressure. As the device tightened, your ribs would press harder and harder against your organs. Your heart, lungs, liver, and stomach would all be compressed. Blood vessels would rupture under the pressure. Some victims would start bleeding from their nose, ears, and eyes as capillaries burst. And here's the truly horrific part. Victims would sometimes bleed from every orifice. The intense pressure would cause blood to seep from their nose, mouth, ears, eyes, and even their pores. Historical accounts describe victims who looked like they were sweating blood as the pressure forced blood through their skin. It was a grotesque spectacle that terrified anyone who witnessed it. The device was specifically designed for people who had been stretched on the rack and survived. If the rack didn't make you talk, they'd put you in the scavenger's daughter next. After having your joints pulled apart, being compressed was even more painful. Your already damaged joints would be forced in the opposite direction, causing even more damage. One famous victim was a Catholic priest named Edmund Campion in 1581. He was first tortured on the rack, then placed in the scavenger's daughter. Historical records say he was tortured so severely that he had to be carried to his execution because he couldn't walk. His body was so damaged from both devices that he was essentially a broken shell of a person. The psychological torture of the scavenger's daughter was intense. Unlike the rack, where you could see what was happening, this device enclosed you completely. You couldn't see how much more it would tighten. You just felt the pressure increasing, your body compressing more and more, and you had no idea when it would stop or if you'd survive. Some victims would pass out from pain and oxygen deprivation, which was actually considered a mercy. Unconscious victims couldn't feel the torture continuing, but torturers would often throw cold water on victims to wake them up, ensuring they remained conscious for maximum suffering. The device was eventually banned, but not because it was considered too cruel. It was banned because it was too effective at causing permanent damage. Victims of the scavenger's daughter often died from their injuries days or weeks later, as their compressed organs failed. The church preferred torture methods that didn't leave obvious physical evidence, and this device left victims too damaged to be useful. Crushing and stretching are horrific, but what about devices designed specifically to destroy individual body parts? Let's talk about the devices that made victims wish for death. Sometimes torturers didn't want to destroy the whole body. Sometimes they just wanted to cause maximum pain in specific areas. That's where devices like thumb screws and the breaking wheel came in. Small, portable, and devastatingly effective. Thumb screws were exactly what they sound like. Devices designed to crush thumbs and fingers. They consisted of two metal bars connected by screws. Your thumb or finger would be placed between the bars, and then the screws would be tightened, slowly crushing the digit. Simple concept, maximum agony. The device was small enough to fit in a pocket, which made it perfect for traveling inquisitors and military interrogators. You could torture someone anywhere, anytime. No need for a dedicated torture chamber or elaborate setup. Just pull out your thumb screws and get to work. As the screws tightened, the pressure on your thumb would increase. At first, it would just hurt. Then your fingernail would crack and possibly be ripped off. Then the bones in your thumb would begin to break. First tiny fractures, then complete breaks. Your thumb would be crushed into a mangled mess of broken bones, torn flesh, and bleeding tissue. But here's what made thumb screws particularly effective. Hands are incredibly sensitive. Your fingers and thumbs have massive amounts of nerve endings, which means crushing them causes disproportionate amounts of pain. The agony of having one thumb crushed was enough to make most people confess to anything. And if one thumb wasn't enough, the torturer would move to the other thumb, then the fingers, one by one. The psychological aspect was brutal. You'd watch as the torturer slowly turned the screw, seeing your thumb flatten and deform. You'd hear the crunch of breaking bones. You'd see blood seeping from under your fingernail. And you'd know that there were 9 more digits they could crush if you didn't tell them what they wanted to hear. Historical records show thumb screws were used extensively during witch trials. Women accused of witchcraft would have their thumbs crushed until they confessed to consorting with demons, flying on broomsticks, or whatever other nonsense the accusers wanted to hear. Many women confessed to impossible crimes just to make the pain stop. Now let's talk about the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel. This device was used for both torture and execution, and it was one of the most public and brutal methods in medieval Europe. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread out like an X. Then the executioner would use a large hammer or iron bar to systematically break every bone in the victim's body. They'd start with the fingers and toes, working their way up to the hands and feet, then the forearms and shins, then the upper arms and thighs. Each strike would shatter bones with a sickening crack that the crowd could hear. Victims would scream with each impact. The executioner would be careful not to hit vital organs or major arteries, ensuring the victim stayed alive and conscious for as long as possible. After all the limbs were broken, the executioner would break the ribs and collarbones. Then, depending on the sentence, they might break the spine, or they might leave the victim alive, their body a broken mess, and prop the wheel up vertically in a public square where they'd die slowly from exposure, dehydration, and shock over the course of days. The breaking wheel was used for the worst criminals. Murderers, traitors, and bandits would be sentenced to the wheel. The punishment was specifically designed to be as public and horrific as possible, serving as a warning to anyone else who might consider similar crimes. One famous case involved a German criminal named Peter Niers in 1581. He was accused of being a serial killer and allegedly confessed to murdering over 500 people, though this number was likely exaggerated. He was sentenced to the breaking wheel. Historical records say the executioner broke his body over the course of 3 days, keeping him alive as long as possible. The wheel was then displayed in the town square where Nier died slowly over another 2 days. The psychological torture of the breaking wheel was immense. You'd be tied to the wheel, unable to move, watching the executioner approach with his hammer. You'd see the hammer rise and fall, breaking the bones of the person before you, and you'd know that you were next. The anticipation of pain was almost as bad as the pain itself. Some executioners were known to show mercy by striking the victim in the chest or head first, killing them quickly before the formal breaking began. This was sometimes done if the victim paid a bribe or if the executioner felt sympathetic, but most victims weren't that lucky. Individual body parts, whole body compression, stretching, all of these are horrific. But what about devices designed to humiliate and torture simultaneously? Some torture devices weren't designed to be lethal. They were designed to humiliate, degrade, and cause intense internal pain. The pair of anguish and the Judas Cradle fall into this category, and they're some of the most disturbing devices ever created because of where they were used on the human body. The pair of anguish was a metal device shaped like a pear with 4 segments. It would be inserted into the victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on their alleged crime. Then a screw mechanism would be turned, causing the segments to slowly separate, expanding inside the body. For victims who had the device inserted in their mouth, usually accused of lying or blasphemy, The pair would expand until their jaw dislocated and their teeth broke. Their mouth would be stretched open so wide that it would tear at the corners. The tongue would be crushed between the expanding segments. Many victims could never speak properly again after this torture. For victims who had the device used internally, the damage was even worse. As the pair expanded, it would tear internal tissue. Organs would be damaged. Blood vessels would rupture. The pain was described as beyond comprehension. And if the torturer opened the pair too far, it could cause fatal internal injuries. The device was rarely fatal on its own, but the damage it caused often led to infections that proved deadly. Internal wounds in an era before antibiotics almost always became infected. Victims would die slowly from sepsis over days or weeks after the torture ended. The Judas cradle was equally disturbing. This device consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat mounted on a pole. The victim would be suspended above the cradle with ropes, then slowly lowered onto the point. The pyramid would be positioned to penetrate the victim either anally or vaginally. As the victim was lowered, their own body weight would cause the pyramid to penetrate deeper. The pain was immediate and intense. The sharp point would tear internal tissue, causing severe damage and bleeding. And here's the truly sadistic part. The torturer controlled how fast the victim was lowered. They could lower you quickly, causing massive trauma all at once. Or they could lower you slowly over hours, letting you feel every millimeter of penetration. Some victims would be left on the cradle for days, their body weight constantly pressing them down onto the point. They couldn't sleep because the pain was too intense. They couldn't rest. They could only suffer. The device was sometimes called the Judas chair because it was said to be invented by a particularly cruel inquisitor who believed it was fitting punishment for traitors, referencing Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus. Whether this origin story is true or not, the device was definitely used, and accounts of its use are documented in historical records. The psychological torture of these devices was immense. The invasion of the body in such intimate and vulnerable areas caused not just physical pain, but profound psychological trauma. Victims who survived often suffered from severe mental trauma in addition to their physical injuries. Both devices were used primarily during the Spanish Inquisition and various witch trials throughout Europe. Women accused of adultery or sexual promiscuity were often tortured with these devices as a form of poetic justice in the twisted minds of their torturers. The message was clear. If you use these body parts for sin, they would be destroyed. So there you have it. Even more brutal torture devices that showcase humanity's incredible creativity when it comes to causing suffering. From the musical screams of the brazen bull to the bone-crushing efficiency of the rack, from the compressing horror of the scavenger's daughter to the targeted agony of thumbscrews and breaking wheels, to the invasive nightmares of the pair of anguish in Judas' cradle. These weren't just methods of execution. They were carefully designed instruments of terror, built to extract confessions, punish crimes, and most importantly, to terrify entire populations into submission. The public nature of many of these tortures was intentional. Watching someone scream in a brazen bull or be broken on a wheel sent a clear message: obey or suffer. What's truly disturbing is that many of these devices were used on people who committed minor crimes, or no crimes at all. Steal bread? Thumbscrews? Question the church? The rack? Be accused of witchcraft? Take your pick of devices. The punishment rarely fit the crime because the crime didn't matter. These devices were tools of control, pure and simple. And while we like to think we've evolved past such barbarism, torture still exists in various forms around the world. We've just gotten better at hiding it and giving it different names. Enhanced interrogation, stress positions, waterboarding. The devices may have changed, but the human capacity for inflicting suffering on other humans remains constant. So next time you're having a bad day, remember, at least nobody's slowly roasting you alive in a bronze bull while turning your screams into music. Modern problems don't seem quite so bad when you have historical perspective. Sleep well, knowing that thumbscrews are now mostly museum pieces and not daily threats.